Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Tricentis. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead, but first I need to cover just a couple of housekeeping notes with you. First of all, we are recording today's session. So if you happen to miss any of our discussion, if you'd like to watch again later, or if you'd like to share with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to access that recording on demand. Now, we do want you guys to engage with us. So if you have any thoughts, comments, concerns, we want you to send those in to us using the chat tab. Whenever you find that chat tab on the right side of your screen, I'd like you to let us know from where in the world you're joining us today. Now, if you have any specific questions, we want you to try to send those into the Q&A tab. Sending your questions to the Q&A just helps us keep track, and we want to answer as many of them as we can today. Additionally, before we close things out today, I will be giving away two $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around to see if you're one of our two lucky winners today. Our topic is improving application quality through test data, and I'm joined today by Harpreet Singh, founder and co-CEO of Launchable Inc., Liam Nguyen, principal software engineer and architect at Tricentis, and leading our discussion today is our very own Mitch Ashley, CTO at Techstrong Group and GM of Techstrong Research. So Liam and Harpreet, thank you both so much for joining us today. Mitch, do you want to dive us right into our conversation?
Absolutely, will do. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Normally, Alan is taking the lead chair on our co-hosting, and I'm spending more time in chat today. I'm kind of doing a little bit of both. Alan's on secret assignment. I'm somewhere in the world, can't disclose, that's why it's secret. No, I'm just kidding. He's doing a little bit of traveling today, in a way, not able to join us. I'm very happy to have this topic. One of the things I've always struggled with is test data and how to get the quality of data, good enough data, representative of what you're going to see in production environments. And then that's changing as your app and environments are changing. Of course, we have AI on the forefront of our work in the world. So I think we're going to be covering a lot of those kind of topics. First, I want to say thank you to our friends at Tricentis. Tricentis is sponsor of the DevOps Unbound series, both the live roundtables as well as episodes on techstrong.tv. So thank you to Liam and the full team at Tricentis for helping us bring this show to you. Now, that said, it's sponsored by Tricentis, but it's not just about Tricentis. Harpreet is joining us from Launchable, another test-oriented company, different perspective on it. And while I don't represent I represent a test company, I have done a lot of testing with software. So we'll get a chance to do that. I do want to ask everybody, though, it's great if you're listening in and kind of following a conversation, picking up this and that from the panelists. We'd love to have you engage with us in chat. These sessions can kind of get rolling if folks engage with us, and you'll see me jumping on chat and reacting to things. We want to know what's your thoughts, impressions, reactions, whatever from what we might be talking about, or maybe we aren't talking about something that's important we should be discussing. So you're welcome to jump in and chat with thoughts and reactions. Also, put questions into Q&A. We're not pushing those off to the end. We'll incorporate that into our dialogue as we're moving forward. So, and as Cody said, there's a giveaway for a couple gift cards, so stick around to the end and you'll learn about that. He'll announce who our winners are. So let's start first by kind of setting the stage. When we say test data, and that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Maybe that's like what I have on my local machine, what I'm pushing into a test environment. Maybe it's generations of the same software. Maybe it's different test environments for different customers. There's a lot of complexities to it. So put some kind of guide rails, fenders around this, Liam, if you want to start us out.
Sure. Test data, I think, can mean a lot of things to different people. For me, test data includes basically, your test cases, the data sets that your test cases use, right? In QTest, I'm a principal engineer from QTest, so I'm going to use QTest as an example here. So QTest has a concept called parameters, right, where you can vary your data sets, right? Ideally, your data sets, should be something that's representative of what you have in production. And your data sets can also include system of the test as well, right? So in the environments your software runs on, right? So that could be hardware or software, right? Depending on what you're testing. Just to give kind of an example, back then when that was a long time ago, when I was doing system tests, system board testing. So I was actually came from a hardware background at Hewlett Packard, right? Your testing include like a drop test, right? Where you see your system board get dropped 8 feet down onto a concrete floor, right? So all that is essentially make up your test data, right? So it can be very comprehensive. It's basic everything, any variables, any inputs that can, negatively or positively affect the outcome, right, of the software.
Jump right in, Harpreet. You're maybe on mute or something there. We're not getting your audio. We were just a minute ago, of course, right before we started. Not hearing it. Cody, maybe if you can help out in the background. Look, oh, are you there now, Harpreet? Not seeing it. Cody, if you wouldn't mind helping Harpreet out. See if we can get his audio working. I feel like I'm doing one of those news shows, like if the audio engineers can help out our guest. Well, you mentioned a good thing, because test data could be like the data you collect from testing, as well as the data you use to actually test with. Yeah. Right. To your point, Liam. And it seems like when we talk about a holistic test quality of your software that you're producing, the quality of the data you're using for that testing, obviously, at least my experience, significantly impacts that, because you're always looking for test coverage and what those scenarios are. But it seems to me the nuances is more in the combination of those things, right? This kind of a scenario, this kind of a product, this kind of a path through a user experience, whatever it might be.
Yep. And I think what's more challenging, right, in today's world, where we have an explosion of data, right, is that all this data will be changing, constantly changing, right? So how do you make all that massive amount of data that's constantly changing into something that's, information, right? Information is essentially things that are actionable upon those data, right? And I do think that's where, there's a lot of opportunity. I know we have a topic on, AI today, and how it can help with our testing and our test data, right? So that definitely will come into play, and we can certainly talk more about that, right? How do we make those massive amount of data into something that's actionable, right? Actionable information that drives business results, right? Because at the end of the day, it is the business objective that you have to, right? It's not about a test. It's not about your test data. It is what you want to achieve from business objective, right, from your software.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Harpreet, how you doing there? Still not hearing you. Maybe if you log off and log back on, that might. Sometimes that's the closest best thing to rebooting, right? If you should try that, see if that might help. So, all right. And Lisette is another guest. Zanan, who's not with us, she may join us in progress too. So, if not, Liam and I will certainly have a great conversation about it. Well, you mentioned AI, and I want to include Harpreet on that discussion, because that's I know an important area for him. I'm curious, as you think about the sort of overall quality of software, how do you measure whether the test data is holding up versus the testing? Where there may be gaps, maybe where improvements are needed. How do you tell if you don't have adequate test data or the right kinds of test data to validate? And you mentioned user experience. We talked about that here in our chat as well. So thanks for engaging with us on that chat, audience. So,
all right.
Okay, you're back. Hey, Harpreet, welcome.
All right, so back from the dead.
I'm glad you got back with us. We're just talking about when in software quality, how do you tell when it's the test data that's lacking versus the testing? So Liam was going to take a shot at that.
Okay. All right. So like we just mentioned on the chat, right? It's about user experience, and it's not just, I call it experience-based objectives, right? So there's many expectation objectives that we can set, right? That basically kind of, scope out your requirements, right? So for example, it's a concrete example, right? Let's say if I add an item to, let's say it's an e-commerce application. If I add an item to a cart, from the time I add an item to a cart to a checkout, it must be, I must be able to check this out and purchase the item within, a certain amount of time, right? And then you can set in some other objectives as well. If you come from a C staff, for example, you may want, okay, I want to do this, be able to handle this scale on a Black Friday. Or by the way, I want to keep my cost down to this much, right? My compute cost to this much, right? So all those are objectives, right? So now going back, how do we make sure that we actually meet those objectives, right? So the process to me is continuous. It must be a continuous process. You can just not say, okay, I'm going to grab a data set from production. I'm going to run my test cases. Oh yeah, we meet objective, we're good. No, it's a continuous process. Essentially, you feed in an initial data set, you run it, you observe the outcome, right? You collect the data back, you do analysis. There's, maybe AI, ML involved, right? And then it's this continuous feedback loop. Okay, do I meet my objective? If not, what do I need to change, right? How do I need to change my data set. I need to change my test cases. I need to change the system and the test, right? So there's a lot of variables at play there. And so the key is, how do I figure out what other things that need to be changed, right? So a lot of analysis and ML could be helpful here in this case.
Harpreet, your perspective on that?
Yeah, I tend to the lens that I really like what Liam said. It's really a continuous process. You're looking at the results and you're sort of figuring out what are the next steps to do there. Our lens at Launchable has not been as much on test data, but sort of the idea that there's like a whole set of data that gets thrown out of your pipeline, and you're not looking at that. But if I go back to Liam's original definition of a number of things, the results from your tests are the test data that feed into the next iteration. And so we take that and we try to figure out what you can do with that. So it's a continuous process. So I tend to agree with Liam there.
It's interesting you mentioned continuous process. Shahid, I think, is the person in our audience is asking, are we talking about continuous integration, continuous delivery? If you kind of think about the whole workflow pipeline, right? It can start early on in developer testing, whether that's unit or more, all the way through, testing that may mimic production environments, right? Harpreet, I know that's something you're especially interested in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Shahid, I think one of our realization, it should be CI/CD. Continuous testing should be part of it. So Liam, feel free to jump in. But where we started thinking about this problem is we realized, like, well, writing tests is just the start of the process, and sort of then you run the tests, and in that context, what are the test data that's useful? But there's like a whole set of stages that we came to is like, well, people are like filtering away the noise that gets generated, kind of going back to analyze, figuring out what's going out. And then there's just this fire hose of test failures that comes and hits us. So how do you analyze the problem? How do you raise the awareness of the problem? Who are the right people to do these things? And then you eventually try to fix it, and then you have to track the fix. So there's just this whole enchilada that opens up, and that's just quote unquote, in the testing process. But there's like a whole set of process that happens, and that sort of, I think it's just pushing, clarifying continuous integration and continuous delivery forward.
Liam, I think you agree with his.
Exactly. And sorry if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. And Chad Wandu. Talk about containerized applications, and I love cloud native architecture. And that's just bring up a whole new ball game in terms of the continuous testing, right? Because the environment is so dynamic, right? When you run your applications, so in a normal traditional functional test, right? When all your 10 of your test cases pass, thumbs up, let's release. No, right? In dynamic environment, you need to pay attention to what is the behavior of your pods, right? Let's say it's on Kubernetes, right? How's your pod movements are you getting pods evicted because of lack of resources and your application, just because the platform is so resilient, right? It can sustain your application, but your application is not running at the behavior that's supposed to be, right? Your container can be shut down and restarted, things like that, right? I'm just giving one example, right? So all that needs to be taken into account. So now you can say, well, my test passed functionally, but hey, it's acting like, all haywire in the Kubernetes environment. So that's not good, right? So there's a lot of things, and everything is so dynamic, right? Because containers can come and go. How do you make sure that you have the ability, right, to capture on that information and analyze that, in situ, right? So that you can capture on those things before the container is gone, because I think it's ephemeral. Very good.
Yeah, it seems like, I forgot who was bringing it up. Someone was bringing about containers. Muzi Wadli was bringing up containerized environment. I mean, you can, in essence, mimic a lot of what your test environment's going to look like if you're working on your own machine, what your production environments may look like, right? If there's multiple, through containerization, by trying to isolate software that's going to be part of that environment. How close can you get to that when you're working on a larger application? Is that realistic to think containerization or things like that can get you pretty close to what production would look like? Or do we always have a pretty significant gap between the two?
I was actually thinking whether that statement holds true on the containerized applications perspective.
Okay. You're
right?
welcome to challenge it too. Yeah.
I think, yes, you can actually, put it on and it's running on different environments. But what you've now done is you still have the integration problem. There's a whole bunch of services instead of that one giant monolith applications, and those services are working very differently. So I think it makes it uh, somewhat complicated than keep it simple. For example, when we were building the product, we started thinking about this as flavors. It's like very different flavors of environments that are going on, and the results that are coming out from these flavors are different as well, right? So um, I think it just makes it a little more complicated, and I don't quite understand, like, within this environment, if you're picking up like mock data, how does that actually um, sort of fall out? People tend to kind of go more towards just, okay, let's push this live in production and then see what's going on. That seems to be the ethos that I see with containerized applications.
Yeah. And I think, so, if you think about containerized applications, right, there are two things. There's essentially your bits, your application bits, and then the configuration of your applications, right? So if you test it in a low environment, or let's say if you test it in, say, AWS, and then you try to run it in Azure, for example, right? It's the configuration, assuming that your application is, 12-factor and everything is externalized, everything is done, correctly, cloud native wise. You're still missing a big part of the testing, right? Is the difference in configuration, the difference in the platform. For example, Azure run a different ingress controller than AWS ingress controller, for example, right? And if you test in AWS alone, and you try to run in Azure, you're missing out the Azure, how your application behaves with the Azure ingress controller, for example, right? So.
Very good. And by the way, Harpreet, while you were rebooting or getting back into Chrome, I held off on the AI question. We're going to ask that in a moment here because I know you're passionate about that. Before we do, how about data analysis of how you can look at the test results, information that's coming out of it? I mean, all the managers in the world are probably like, pass, fail, we good, can we go, whatever. But there's a lot more insights. I'm oversimplifying, but there's a lot more insights and information in all of that test data that we create from the process of testing. How do we make sure what techniques of how we can dig into that without wasting time, but spending valuable time getting valuable information from it. Who'd like to jump on that?
Yeah, so I'll jump on that. I mean, that's really the thesis where we started Launchable, which was like, all right, you have all this, information that's coming in. What do we do with it? So keeping aside the AI thing, because you said we'll keep that aside for a moment. But what we see here is, there are very simple things you can do here. So, for example, we see teams actually looking at their data to figure out, like, are these tests healthy or unhealthy, right? And most commonly asked question is, are my tests flaky, right? And so you have this information, and suddenly your test, which was supposed to pass, has stopped passing, and then it flips back on and it flips back off. And if you walk into an engineering organization, most devs have this idea, most testers have this idea that there's something flaky here, that test is flaky here. And that knowledge is sort of sitting in everybody's heads. And so and I'm a product manager, and when somebody comes back and tells the product manager, we're going to focus on, improving test X, the question gets asked is why, right? And why test X? And it's very hard, people have a hard time actually justifying that. So even something like that, we've seen some organizations look at that information to actually analyze and say, like, what are the tests that are causing us friction? Can we go about fixing that? And then, that's one place that you can just use data to go figure out things. Fairly easy to do.
Yep. And that's also, it helps, right? In terms, just go back to the requirement, right? When we create a requirement, right, for those test cases, right, it's also very helpful to create clear-cut, what I call, objectives, right, expectations, right? What are your objectives to define, what is a passing versus a failed test, right? And a lot of those, that's why we have non-functional versus functional requirements. And I think a lot of times people just miss some, non-functional aspects of it, especially like, response time, uptime, things like that, right? And the data set as well is very important because, okay, it works for, 100 users, will work for 1,000 users, will work for 1 million users, right? So all those need to be well defined, right? And then you need to have basically the metrics, right, to collect all that information so that it can tell you, well, is it within, the boundary that you set forth, right?
One aspect of this too is there's data that comes from the testing itself. It's also correlating that back to things that we do see in production in user experience. So it might be performance, like you're talking about, Liam, just saying, we're not up to our SLA or what we expect to deliver for user experience. Or it could be bugs or issues, security issues, things that we might see from the production environment, and do some analysis on the data to say there's a place there where we overlooked something, or a place where we could actually found that but didn't do something about it. There's more than just go back and fixing the code. You may actually be doing some things that are kind of masking that issue as well. Even if the code was fixed, you might not know it.
I think one of the challenges, since you mentioned about changing code, right? One of the things that's kind of hard to do. I mean, if you're gonna do it like, manually with 70 tools, right, is how do you identify the risk of a change introduced into the system, right? Could it be code, right? Could be updating a library, could be change in, usage, user access pattern, right? Change in environment, right? When a change is introduced, there's always some, side effects, introduced into the system. How do you identify what are the tests? How do I change my test data to reflect that? How do I change my test cases to reflect that change? What are the risks involved, right? So all those are the questions that, one has to ask, right? You can certainly answer, oh, let's just run everything, right? But most of the time, people don't have that kind of time, right, to run regress everything, right? So you have to identify, the area that's, that risk has been introduced and the impact analysis associated with it.
So I promised to the audience that Liam and me have just met here, but that just seemed like a perfect setup for me to come in and talk about Launchable and AI and so on and so forth. So if it's, I have your permission, Mitch, I'm going to just do that. Right. So I
I'm
promised
surprised
Liam
I
and
held you
have
back this far talking about AI, but go for it.
never met. So actually, AI and machine learning kind of helps you answer those questions. So if you go out and look at, approaches like test impact analysis and predictive test selection, which Facebook actually pioneered, um, it is asking that same question: is like, well, we had all these changes, and what is the impact of these changes on the test? Can we actually change our mentality in testing, which sort of looks at like, you know, things either pass or fail, and I'm never going to let them fail, right? That's like the approach, to going to a more risk-based approach. It's like, well, I know things will always fail. How do I, take that risk and think about my testing, right? I can liken it to like, when I was writing applications and we were writing monolith applications, your answer was you'll design your applications so that they would never fail. And what containers have done is said like, no, failure is part of life. We'll embrace that failure as opposed to running away from that failure. So the AI techniques out there kind of let you do that, right? So at Launchable, we do that. We've productized, predictive test selection, and the idea here is we look at your code changes and we look at your past test results. So your past test results become your test data. And then we can bring those together. And next time something changes, we start predicting, hey, what's the risk? What tests are likely to fail? Can we prioritize them up first so that we get that feedback coming in much, much earlier in the cycle than in the past? You don't have to run all these things. So to BM's question, I think AI and machine learning are opening all those avenues for teams today, right? You certainly don't have to use us, but these approaches exist today, and you can use them.
Yep, that's right. Presentis is also doing, so we have a tool, Live Compare, which kind of does the risk analysis similar to
Awesome.
what you described. And we are basically piloting, OpenAI capability, right?
Mm-hmm.
To help basically, not just identify the risk, but then, introspect both the test results data, code, right? And come out with, what are the test case, right? I call it test case questions, right? Well, what are the test cases that we should generate? Could be new ones, or could be there could be there's a repertoire of test cases, right? How do we reuse those things? How do we combine them to meet this new change, right? Make sure that the change is well covered, right, so to speak.
I'm curious, machine learning, when we're talking about that part of AI, either takes a large amount of data for unsupervised learning or guided learning for supervised, this is the correct result, this is not, or identified as whatever. Do you see either approach being more usable in a test data, applying it to that? Now, you could argue if you're doing a hosted service of testing, right, you may have a large amounts of data that can be anonymized and applied. You can turn a machine learning algorithm unsupervised against it. Maybe not so if you're not that big of a shop, you're just looking at your own data. How do you see ML being applied in a testing domain like that?
So if I understand that right, you're kind of saying, how can I use ML to look at the test data itself and see what it does? That's a very interesting question. So I'm going to focus on hone in on the piece that I talked about earlier, which was, we were finding, if we sort of define test data as like the environments that you're running in, right? They just become like an input to your analysis, right? So the beauty with machine learning is that the way I think about it, we humans kind of do this all the time. It's like, all right, the test data changed here. It changed in so many ways, and maybe there's some things that there's a downstream impact of that. And too often these signals are like very fuzzy and very low, right? And what machine learning algorithms do is help you pull, find the guidance out of that. So in some ways, I don't find it too different than the approach that I was talking about, which is like, well, feed that back into your algorithm, and the algorithm is going to go figure out internally what patterns exist, right? So it's really great at detecting these patterns. To your earlier part of this setup was like, how much data do you need? So from our experience, right, we've focused on automated testing just because if you're running on manual tests, they run on whatever iteration and whatever cycles they run, and that's not enough data. But most often, at least in the domain that we are on, like you don't need a whole lot of iterations. You don't need a whole lot of automated tests. You don't need like tens and thousands of tests, which is what like, LLM kind of world would make you believe. You have like a few hundred tests or 150 and 200 tests that are running often enough, right? And that often enough is generating enough tests for you to actually data for you to go and analyze.
Yeah, one thing about AI and ML, right, is it's really good at um, identifying patterns that we otherwise wouldn't, or a tester, right, wouldn't be able to see, and being able to identify those data access pattern, those usage pattern, right, and feedback to how you build your test cases, how you generate your test data, right, to mimic really real world scenarios, right? I think that's that's one of the advantages, one of the big advantages for AI ML, especially in terms of test data generation.
Yeah, so I think of the world as like twofold, since you picking up your last word. So there's the test generation aspect, and then there's the test execution aspect, right? And test generation, I don't think has the data problem, and not that Liam, you said that, so I don't want to come across like that. Test generation is more of, I think the LLM world. It needs a lot of data. You're generating a lot of, taking a lot of information um, to generate the written test. I'm not talking about the UI test aspect. And I think we are still very early in that. I don't think the tests generated are going to be like magical. You're still sort of working through it. Um, I was just on a panel the other day and somebody was saying, well, magically my test got generated, but I just realized that it was generating bugs. So now my work increased to actually debugging what bugs were introduced, in that process. And the other part is test generation and running tests. In that, you don't need a whole lot of information. That's where you start applying machine learning, because that's where you're trying to find patterns, and the state of art in machine learning is much more advanced there for you to kind of come in and bring in and apply those techniques than say on the test generation part. So perhaps that's another way to sort of think about bringing AI into the organization, is like, where the state of the art is. And one part is fairly sexy at the moment, but relatively unbaked. The other part is much more workhorsey, and you can apply that.
Yeah, it seems. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Liam.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, at the state of AI, right, I believe in human reinforcement feedback loop, right, RLHF, right. The state of AI today, right, it can get things wrong. And when it gets things wrong, it's kind of a black box. Well, how did it suggest that, right? And so there's need to be this feedback loop, right, to basically always fine tune the model, right? And I think it depends on even from customer to customers, right, from test environment to test environment, right? Those models can be certainly fine tuned, right? Depending on what you're testing, right? Let's testing like e-commerce application versus testing, a military application, or even hardware, right? We do have hardware people using our software to test their hardware, for example. So each of those basically build out a special knowledge, right? A domain-specific knowledge that's the model need to be trained on, right? To get better at it.
It seems like to generate tests, as you were bringing up earlier, one of the things that AI needs is lots of context, right? You mentioned LLMs. You'd have to have a good understanding of it would need to know a good understanding of your code base, maybe what testing you're already doing. Something that a generic LLM's going to have much about you. So to get valuable, I think it's one of the reasons why you get errors out of specifically generative AI, or they call them hallucinations. Someone on a panel recently called that it's bad math is what that is. Is you don't have the context, right, to be able to really make the appropriate connections to answer the question or ask it to do what it's asking you to do. I'm curious, we talked about ML a little bit. What about the area of generative AI? I mean, there's sort of the natural language interface to things, right? You can say, what is this series of tests doing? And is it covering this scenario? What are some of the ways we might use generative AI either today or down in the near future? Do you see? You want to jump on that, Liam?
Sure, I think there's plenty of opportunity there, right? I did mention earlier, right? Your test is as good as your requirements, right? If you have fuzzy requirements, you're gonna have fuzzy test cases, right? So one opportunity there could be, using generative AI to help you, fine tune your requirement, right? AI can help you. Fine tune, hone in, what are exactly your requirements are, break it down, right? So that they are very prescriptive and concise, right? So that you can help, produce better test cases, right? Better expectations, clearer expectations on those, objective that I mentioned, experience-based objectives, right? What are the things that needs to be delivered there? So that's one area, right? And then if you think about, from the requirement on, right, actually helping you generate out the test cases, right? That both test cases and test data as well. Harnessing, all the observability, it comes back identifying patterns, right? To basically say, okay, for, this environment, right? What are the test data I should have? What are the test cases I should run, right? So all those things, right, it's a continuous feedback loop, right? So that's just, just a couple of use cases there.
So, so Liam's talked mostly on the test generation part. My bias is more towards what happens. You had after that. You have now a fire hose of failures. You're trying to analyze what these are. And that's where I think generative AI can actually move the state of the art forward. So something that we are doing at the moment, and we're running a beta program around it, is this notion that, when you have bunch of these test failures that come out, are these, let's say you have 500 test failures that came out. Are these the same failures, underlying issues? Are these different issues, right? I'm like, as a dev or QA, I'm spending hours going through stack traces. Like, is this the same stack trace that I saw like 5 pages earlier? Is this different? And I think generative AI can just come in and help us analyze and get there much, much quicker. And we feel that's like a very pragmatic next step in terms of pushing the state of the work forward. Is like, can I look at the results and can I actually, classify these results? Can I get these guys to help me summarize things that I spend hours and hours, going through? And so that's sort of where our emphasis has been in the last few months.
That's a good point about one thing generative AI is really good at doing. I say good, if not really good, is summarizing information, right?
Yeah.
You could use it for filling out reports. Let's say, for example, compliance information you might have to provide,
Right.
either internally to third parties, to customers for contracts. regulatory, whatever it might be, for like us, say a SOC compliance or something where you're needing to provide that kind of information. Seems like that could save you a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, I
right
think
there.
to me that's sort of the next stage. We're not there even. So there's like just something much simpler today, right? It's like, hey, I have like this stack trace, and I'm going through this. Like, so one of the things we've just put out is like, all right, I can tell you instead of you going through 10,000 lines of stack traces, here's the 5 problems. This stack trace means that you have like this log4j problem. Just picking up on log4j for no particular reason. But now I need to see like those 5 lines instead of going through 50,000 lines of code. And then I think eventually you get to the point where you can take all of this information and feed it into a compliance report somewhere, right? So that's how we are thinking about it. It's like very pragmatic, like crawl before you walk kind of things that you can do today. And there's just a whole host of things that people can actually just bring in, connect to open, chat GPT or any other LLM and start analyzing their information in-house.
Yeah, Mandana also brought up the topic of pattern recognition, which of course is what AI is best at. One
Yeah,
of the things it's good at.
right. So Mandana, going back to the example I was giving earlier, which is like, all right, I have 500 test failures. Are these like the same one underlying issue? Like, is the environment bad? Or I have 500 issues which 500 people have to chase in on. And machine learning is absolutely great at helping you classify those and understand those. And that's based on your data. And you don't need a whole lot of, new data out there to kind of go train. So that those are the kinds of things that machine learning can help with.
Okay.
And I think if you combine on that, pattern recognition, right, back into how do I use that information, right, to help improve my test case generation, for example, right? So basically, it's AI reinforcing AI essentially, right? And hopefully one day the vision, at least my vision, is getting to a state where we have an fully autonomous testing system, right? Where the AI will help improve itself testing, right? With as little human involvement as possible. At least that's the nirvana, right?
Yeah, there's different views on that, right? Does AI take over? Is AI an aid, right? Unless you do more,
Yep.
in the same amount of time with fewer resources, right?
Yeah, I think the right way to think about this is the co-pilot approach. In I think Microsoft struck gold with sort of talking about it as a co-pilot. We've certainly started seeing it this way. It's like, all right, I'll go back to the same example. If we are helping you understand these failures better, it's a co-pilot that's sitting on your team that's actually helping you do this versus going out and replacing what you're doing. And you can just focus on maybe writing better tests or making that environment much more stable than actually sitting down and, producing logs or analyzing these things. And then you can start doing some higher order stuff.
Very good. Well, I'd like to let me check. Someone entered a question here. I'd like to kind of take it back to ultimately, right? It's about improving user experience, the quality of what we're producing, and in terms of software, what we're delivering to either the business or the end customer. What are the right metrics now to be looking at, right? We used to look at code coverage, right? You could have great coverage and still have crappy software. We can look at, how many errors there are in production. We can measure user experience in terms of response time, things like that. In the world that we're in today and kind of adding AI to this mixture, we could really get sort of caught up in the whirlwind of testing and maybe lose sight of ultimately what matters at the end of the day. How do you boil it down to, here's how we decide? You mentioned requirements, Liam. Even the requirements document could go far afield, right? Could talk about way too many things and ultimately kind of help. We could miss from it what the most important things are to focus on if you want to start us out. I'd love your perspective on, we put this all into a bundle, but how do we make sure we're focusing on the 2 or 3 things that really matter?
Yeah. So I think, like I said, it's all start out with the requirement. In fact, we're working on an AI capability, right, to help you refine your requirements. Because I believe that that's, if you start out with good requirements, you're kind of halfway there already. And in your requirements, right, that's defined essentially what pass, what fail. And passing and failing is not, like I say, it's not just a functional thing as well, like before, right? A lot of it can be, cost, for example, right? You can deploy this software, but if it's too costly, for example, is that still the right solution, right? There's several aspects of that needs to go into defining that requirement. So I think that's that's a key for it.
My perspective is I've talked to lots and lots of organizations. So as a product manager, I feel like if I could boil everything down into one sort of giant number that I give you, like you're doing good on this score, that's perfect. But unfortunately, I don't think that's the way the world works. Every organization that we walked into has like different metrics that they care about and they optimize for. And so it could be very well what Liam's talking about is like, is this service going to be too costly for us to run? If that matters to your organization, yes. One of the lens we've taken is like, well, are your tests unhealthy? And if unhealthy, what does unhealthiness mean for your organization? Like, maybe that's what you care about. But if I zoom this to a meta level and I bring the AI and machine learning sort of aspect to it, one of the things that I personally have learned is like, it's perhaps really time to think in terms of, risk versus binary things. What is the risk that is the system is bringing in, and how do I tolerate that? And that changes on various things, on various metrics within your organization, right? So, simple example is you mentioned code coverage. Well, I'm going to run everything, all the tests, all the time, and figure out like what does that mean. But no, if I actually ran 10% of the tests and I got 90% issues covered, is that good enough for my organization? Is that going to bring the right velocity? And so I think as AI machine learning, it kind of makes us ask these kinds of questions that weren't available to us before. So in some ways, we need to start sort of thinking about those as we think about metrics.
Yeah.
And if somebody on the chat has like one magical metric that I don't know about, please put it. I will work on getting in that product.
Yeah, I love to hear about that too.
Maybe they've got a GoFundMe so you can get the answer from them. I was just going to chime in, and one of the things, kind of my answer to my own question was, which is what you're saying, Harpreet, is it depends. I mean, I learned, for example, working in the airline industry, that it's all about performance. We'll take a lot more errors. We'll take database pointer errors. We'll take all kinds of errors if we can meet the performance requirements. It's one of the reasons why the people at that desk are oftentimes hitting the button twice, right? Hitting the enter key twice, because it may have gotten something that didn't quite go all the way through. But if you think about, people are producing software that go into satellites or devices going into space, recoverability is prime. We just don't want that thing to ever freeze that we can't recover and get back to a point where we can talk to the device, update it, whatever it might be to get it to recover. So, those are, we might say the space example is extreme, though there are a lot of people working on the devices that go into into the upper atmosphere and beyond. But airline systems have to deal with that a lot. So to your point, it's kind of what matters, right? It may not be one factor. It's the combination of things, like we have to deliver the right customer experience. What level is that? What's good enough? Doesn't have to be perfect. What happens when errors do occur, and what happens when the unexpected occur? Kind of the topic of resilience, right? And how our software responds to those conditions. I want to take it back to, I know you'll drag me kicking and screaming, back to the topic of AI ML. Jordan asked a question about how can I get started integrating AI or ML into my test debugging? What's your suggestions for getting started? I mean, obviously there's products companies offer. If they want to kind of go after, is it like get a hold of PyTorch and start writing some algorithms against some data? What's a good way to get started?
I would suggest go look at existing tooling out there. They make it turnkey for you. You don't, setting up machine learning infrastructure and so on and so forth is not easy, right? So go look at tools such as ours. Look at something else if you want to, but that's sort of where I would start off with, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Unless you're doing something like, all right, we'll just use open AI to do something here in terms of like maybe looking at generating some content for the data and so on, but otherwise just go and look at existing tooling out there.
I would add there definitely are commercial and open source offerings. My general suggestion about AI, whatever the domain is it's early, especially in generative AI. It's still early in the application of AI, even machine learning, to some of these problems. And part of knowing how to use it is understanding it, and you can do some experimentation on your own. So go take some of your own test data, and maybe you do write some PyTorch, Python algorithm against it, or maybe you do load it into a if it's not confidential, into a generative AI system and experiment with it and see what you can learn by using those. Some people are setting up their own LLMs to be able to try that kind of thing out. So there is the experimentation option. And I think the benefit of that is you may not come out with the solution you're going to use in the end, but you might kind of increase your own kind of knowledge level of AI, whatever the domain. So when you do talk to a company or you do look at open source software, you've got a little bit more to kind of fall back on and understanding what you're being told or how it's working, or maybe even what you're looking for. So I think that's always a good approach. At least that's what I recommend on AI today, because there's a lot of us that are still sort of learning the domain ourselves, right?
So Mitch, I'm going to disagree with you on that. So
okay, feel free. You're welcome.
As a product vendor who's doing this for last 4 years, I think it depends on which area that you pick up on in terms of what you're doing. But one of the challenges that I see with most people is like, I need to understand what's underneath the black box of this machine learning algorithm, right? And that's a very, that's how we think about it as humans, is like, what's going on underneath it? Let me unpack it and see. But especially with machine learning, you really don't understand what's actually going inside. If I told you like there's a decision tree and that decision tree is going on and doing thousands and thousands of things, that's about it, right? So the way you evaluate these machine learning systems is like by their scores, like how well are they performing, how are they doing statistically. The implementation is almost like immaterial, if I may say so, right? So that's, I think, a rewiring that needs to happen, and I certainly have to do that with customers who come to us. It's like, no, you can dig down, but that's really not going to do much. Go look at the score of the statistical thing and see how that performs, and that's what gives you the information. So at that point, then the way you start thinking about it is somewhat different than the traditional software world, which is I needed to understand everything that's going on, right?
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, one other thing, I would say, with that question from Jordan, right? It really depends on what you are after, what constitutes, right, a passing test in your case, right? And use those as basically training exercises, right, for the AI, right? To say, okay, this is the role model you should go after, right? And train in a way that that makes it into a repeatable pattern, right? And yeah. But again, the data set is specific to exactly what you define to be a passing test versus a failing test. Right?
All right, great. Well, hey, we're free to disagree, and two things can be true at once, right? All right. Well, I think with that, ending on the AI conversation is a great place to wrap things up. It's been a lot of fun talking with you both and getting different perspectives, a diverse perspective. What's really interesting to me is how much the testing genre part of our industry is probably going to evolve over the next few years coming, right? I mean, you think about the addition of AI into this, and we've had a lot of things happen, a lot of great kind of different kinds of testing and automation into our workflows and et cetera. And AI presents some interesting futures. We'll see where we end up, where we go. I think it's more where we go, not where we end up, right? It's a continuous journey, if you will. Great. Well, thank you, Harpreet. Thank you very much, Liam. Cody, if you're online, I think we might have a few folks who are like, hey, what about those gift cards? You guys going to be handing those out anytime soon. So are you with us there, Cody? Back to you in
Sure
the
am.
room.
Sure am, Mitch. I hope I'm on screen, but
Yes.
I
hear
am
you.
here.
We hear you.
Awesome. So thank you to our panel today, Harpreet and Liam. We really appreciate you joining us on Techstrong Learning and bringing your expertise and your insights to our table. So once again, thank you.
Pleasure.
I'd like to remind our audience that we have recorded our session today. So following this program, you'll receive an email with a link to access that recording on demand. You can also find it living on the DevOps website. That's devops.com/webinars, and you'll find it in the on-demand section. The two winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Casey B and Lori A. So to Casey and Lori, I'll be emailing you here soon to get these gift cards over to you. But if you don't happen to see an email from me, check your spam folder just in case it happens to be filtered out. I'd like to thank Tricentis for sponsoring our program. And to everyone here, thank you so much for joining us today on Techstrong Learning. We love having audience that feeds into our conversations, participates, sends in questions and chats. So thank you so much for your participation today. There will be a survey that pops up on your screen as soon as we close out, and we'd love to hear your thoughts, whether they're about today's session or upcoming topic suggestions. Just let us know there. Either way, we hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong Learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Thanks again, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.